Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you may be joining us from for this Digital Medicine and MedTech Showcase panel, Regulatory Update for AI-Enabled Hardware. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us and also the AAIH with whom we've co-organized this session. With that, I will hand it over to our moderator, Lena Kontos from Hogan Lovells. Lena.
Thanks so much, Claire, and so pleased to be here today with everyone. As Claire said, my name is Lena Kontos. I'm a partner at the law firm of Hogan Lovells in the FDA Medical Device Group. And I'm going to focus today, I think, on our wonderful panelists that have joined us here today. So perhaps I'll turn it right over to Valentin to introduce himself.
Thank you, Lena. Hello, everybody. I'm Valentin Tablan. I'm the Chief AI Officer at AISO in Cambridge, England. I'm an AI scientist by training, and I've been working with AISO for the last 5.5 years, where we provide the cognitive behavioral therapy to patients in the English National Health Service. And alongside the care delivered by our therapist, we have been developing AI-supported tools to improve quality of care. And recently, we started focusing on automating elements of patient assessment and care delivery. Thank you.
Hey, thanks. Jennifer, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Sure, thanks, Lena. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Newberger. I'm the VP of Regulatory and Compliance at Cognito Therapeutics. And we are developing a digital platform for non-invasive treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And I'm really excited to be here today with everyone.
Great. And our third panelist, Esther.
I'm Esther Bleicher. I'm Chief Counsel, Therapeutics and Product and Technology at Valo Health, which is a technology company that is trying to improve and transform drug discovery and development through the use of AI. Prior to joining the startup scene in Cambridge 2.0, in Cambridge in Massachusetts, I was at the FDA working on FDA's digital health policies, among other roles.
Great, wonderful. Well, without delay, I think we should just get started. Lots of really interesting things going on in the machine learning space these days in the healthcare area. And so maybe we can start off with a discussion about where things are being developed. You know, this is over the last few years, I think we've seen a lot of innovation in these adaptive algorithms and software space, particularly in the diagnostic area with analysis of images. Where do you think the industry is heading as we use this technology in spaces? Are we going to continue seeing most development in diagnostics, or are we moving to other areas? Maybe Esther, you want to get us started?
Sure. So one thing that's so exciting about this area is that there really are so many players and so many new players that are coming on. So it's hard to know from my vantage point now exactly where everything is going to go. I think there's still a lot to do in the diagnostic space. And in particular, even just in that clinical decision support space, where there's still a lot of images to analyze and to figure out exactly how to help physicians and other healthcare providers do a better job or be more efficient in diagnosing patients using images.
Great. Valentin, I know you're very heavily involved from the actual development side of things. Where are you focusing on and what are you seeing?
So we're a bit of a strange fish in the AI and healthcare world, in the sense that we don't actually work in computer vision, in imaging. We work with language, because our focus is therapy, psychotherapy, which is delivered by talking between a patient and a therapist. The kind of data that we have is all based on language. We have treated over the last 10 years now something in the area of 100,000 patients. And our treatment modality is via text. So patient and therapist chat to each other online during the 1 hour a week regular therapy session. And as a side effect of that, we have accumulated a very large corpus. We think is probably the largest such corpus in the world, of something like 500,000 sessions of therapy. And because of the way the system works here in the UK, we also have clinical symptom measurements at every session. So from the point of view of doing data science, is an ideal corpus where you have what the intervention was that was given to the patient in the form of the words of the therapist, and you can track the evolution of symptoms throughout care. So that kind of corpus opened up lots of opportunities for us. And like everybody, we first thought about diagnostics and trying to understand when a patient presents to us what presenting condition they have. But we quickly moved on to quality assurance, which was the first tool that we've actually developed, which is an area that's not directly part of the care pathway, but it's adjacent to that. We have our clinical supervisory team being able to monitor the care delivered by a network of hundreds of therapists. We have over close to 1,000 hours of therapy delivered every day. And because of the AI tools we have, we're able to monitor the quality of care that is being delivered and the fidelity to treatment. So that's something that's different. And we're now looking towards building tools for assessment, which I guess is close to diagnostics. So we have some tools in the area of supporting patients identify their own symptoms and understand what kind of care they may benefit from. But again, because we work in the area of language, another avenue that is open to us is building AI-supported tools for actual care delivery. So having conversational agents that deliver elements of care in a manner similar to how therapists do it, that's something which in the area of psychotherapy can be envisioned. And that's something that we're actively working on at the moment.
Very, very fascinating. Jennifer, do you want to add anything to all of that?
Well, since we're working on the therapeutic side of things, I'll just add a couple thoughts on that. I mean, I think this is where this connection between AI and digital health and like personalized medicine can really have an impact, because as you collect more information and have AI that can evolve and learn as it's in the field and as there's more data available, you could also have platforms that are available to deliver more specialized therapeutics within a range, let's say, right? But that's more particular for any individual receiving that therapy, instead of one therapy for everyone that may work but not as well in certain individuals. And so I think there's some really exciting opportunities there for AI as well.
Great, that's a really interesting point. As we all know from having dealt with FDA for many years, even before these adaptive algorithms were in place, FDA likes a lot of data to verify that something and validate that something is working as it's intended. When we get into adaptive algorithms, this becomes a little bit more challenging, of course. So FDA has set out a framework for how it plans to address AI ML tools going forward, in including a predetermined change control plan set in place for its framework for dealing with adaptations to algorithms as things continue to develop and as data sets grow. Do you have any thoughts about the status of that plan and how it's actually being implemented by FDA? Obviously, it's fairly new, and as things are new, they will continue to be developed. Does anyone have any real world experience or thoughts that they want to share about that?
I don't have any insight personally into how it's being handled by FDA. I mean, I think it's a really interesting concept, and it's similar to things you're seeing in like the Valid Act for diagnostics. So I think there is this concept of this predetermined change control plan. I think it also puts a lot of pressure, I'm not sure if it's good or bad, but on the companies to really think about what do they want the product to look like, not just today or not just after that first clearance or approval, but 5 years from now. That's sort of like, if you could go big and sort of get what you want, what's that going to look like and what's it going to take to get there? And in some ways, I think that having that ability to get that change plan approved with FDA does actually, it helps a lot. It doesn't mean you have to make those changes down the road, right? But you're sort of setting forth what you think might be possible based on the data you have to date, and giving you the flexibility to make those changes moving forward. So I don't know if anyone has any more insight into what they can say about how FDA is handling it, but I mean, in theory, it sounds promising. It's always the devil's in the details.
Yeah, of course. And maybe I can broaden the question a little bit more to not just specifically talk about the change control plan, but just general interactions with FDA, as this is a new area. And, you know, as often happens in the area of developing is regulators, you know, FDA is a regulatory body, has to react to what it's seeing in industry as people develop new and novel, exciting developments. Regulators are forced to react to it. So perhaps I'll broaden the question a little bit into, instead of just dealing with the forward-looking changes to algorithms, but just FDA's interactions in general with new companies and existing companies on, you know, these types of software products that are coming through the agency. They've obviously, you know, hired some new specialists in this area, but maybe Esther, I know you've had some recent discussions with FDA. Perhaps you want to share your thoughts on those interactions and the type of information that FDA is looking for.
Well, so what I would say is that when I was at FDA, and I think that this is true to today, that there's really been an attempt to flip that reactiveness and to try to be more forward thinking and to try to be more proactive. And it's really hard because FDA knows better than anybody what's already out there. I mean, they've reviewed all of these applications, but it's hard for them to really know what's down the pike. And so they've tried a lot of different ways that have really been novel to get more public input, to get more information from industry, to try to put policies in place that will stand the test of time. And it's just hard because there's so many changes. I mean, to echo what Jennifer said, like, I think that the plan that FDA put forward is like directionally good, and maybe it will work and maybe it will be right. But there's also the part of the hope of AI is that surprising results will happen that then will further personalize medicine, that we'll just learn new things that we would never have learned otherwise, that we wouldn't have been able to plan for. But now we can see that there are patterns in health and healthcare that we can leverage to make people's lives better. And it's just hard to make policy now for those in the future.
So how can companies best be prepared then? And, you know, at the end of the day, FDA is going to have to sign off on this. What are things that companies should be thinking of as they are developing this technology and before they head to FDA and in their interactions with FDA?
So I'm going to jump in one more time, and then I will let my colleagues follow. I mean, the way that I think about this is pretty old school, in that FDA at the end of the day is a risk-based agency that cares about science and patients. And the science is evolving and changing, and FDA is actually not, that's not news to the agency to see new kinds of science emerge and to have to deal with that. But so at the end of the day, when I think about coming forward to FDA with new technologies, new ways of analyzing data, new kinds of products, I just think about, okay, how can I convey that this science is, that we should believe it, that it's real, that it's justified, that it's scientifically appropriate, and that it's helping patients. And if I can draw that line, then I think it's something that FDA should be ready to accept.
Jennifer, do you want to add?
Sure. I mean, obviously, you know, FDA is a data-based organization. And so to the extent there are data to show, that's always helpful. I think the challenge is that a lot of times these conversations need to happen before there's enough data to really influence FDA with respect to its thinking. And so I think this is where you also have that intersection of the data and the science, which is always, of course, super important, but also sort of from a policy perspective, kind of taking it back a little bit and saying, like, what makes sense for the public health moving forward? Like, we too, as industry, are of course concerned about patient safety and welfare, right? We don't want to be putting products out there that are going to harm patients. And I think there needs to be a little bit of that trust and understanding between the agency and industry in order to have these conversations about what might work and make sense at a bigger picture level. Like, let's put the regs aside for a minute. Like, let's not think about it in terms of how we've thought about devices historically, right? If we are going to progress the thinking on digital health and software and AI and all of the things that have happened in the last, decade in those spaces, some of it, before you even get to the data and the science, just kind of thinking about what's going to allow patients to benefit quickly and efficiently to benefit from these new technologies. And that's a different type of conversation, I think, but it's an important one. And so I think your question, Lena, was about, FDA kind of figuring out how to handle some of this, but I do think a lot of the burden's on industry. Have those conversations with FDA. Don't wait, right? Don't wait for other companies to do it because they might not say what you want to say, right? And don't wait for FDA to come up with some policy that's going to be everything you wanted it to be. Like, FDA doesn't know because they aren't in the field. And to Esther's point, yeah, they've seen all these applications, they've approved them all, but they're looking at it through a different lens. And so I think that relationship between the two is really critical. And I think FDA wants companies to have a seat at the table right now. I mean, that's what they're asking for.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a very big, in some ways, an educational component that has to come along with your interactions with FDA. It's not just going in and saying, hey, here's our validation algorithm. What do you think of this study? But really explaining, the clinical need for a product, how we got there, how the data sets were analyzed to get there. So a bit of education. And so keeping on this education theme a bit, obviously, as this type of software is sort of the software du jour of the day and the product du jour of development. There's lots of companies that are interested in getting into this space that may not historically have been software companies or may not even be medical device companies historically, but are seeing an area. And we've seen lots of, obviously, tech and consumer companies enter the medical product space over the last couple of years. But what are some of the challenges that come along with that? What do companies need to be thinking about as they enter, both the regulated medical space for those that haven't been medical device companies, or, specifically into the digital software therapeutic, diagnostic space? For those have been, let's say, more traditional medical device companies. Valentin, maybe you can get us started.
Sure. So AAIH traditionally was a clinical organization. So we were managing a network of therapists for delivering care. And then as we started transitioning towards building medical technology and entering the medtech space, you clearly have to hire a technical team. And pretty much every person who works in AI that you find comes from technology, and from technology and from software development, and it's very rare for them to have medical experience before joining it, at least in our case. So what I noticed as we're growing our team is a very interesting difference in cultures. So you have the people who come from the clinical world, who have a certain understanding of how things should be done, how things should be measured. And you have people from the technology background who have a different attitude to risk. The software developers write a piece of code, they compile it and see if it works. And then if it doesn't, they try again. So every time you try, it's the standard way of doing things. And you don't necessarily think of the risk when you press the compile button. Whereas when you're building something that is a medical device, you can't just try version after version after version, hoping that one of them will start working. You can't just, to borrow a phrase, move fast and break things. You have to actually be quite considered in how you do things. But I think there's potentially too much being made of AI. If you're building tools to provide care for patients, there are well-established protocols for how you measure if those things work, if they have an impact. The statistical significance, the rules don't change just because one arm of your trial has AI in it. You just do it the same way you do it trying to measure any other intervention. So I think it's a matter of being responsible, having the right kind of team who can train the newcomers into how things are established from a statistical point of view, from a data point of view, and then try and fit your work into that pattern. And kind of coming a bit back to the previous conversation, the regulatory space in AI is very, very mobile at the point, is very dynamic. And we don't, as companies, don't necessarily know where the regulator will end up in terms of position, but we know what they're trying to achieve. They're trying to manage risks to the patient whilst enabling these exciting developments to happen. So if we take a responsible approach of measuring, of only putting forward something that we're confident works because we've measured it using the traditional approaches that have been tested for decades, then it's fairly safe to assume that we won't end up in a place that's very different from where the regulators will end up. So if you have proven to your science team that your data does indeed prove that it works, then you'll end up in a good place.
Okay. Jennifer, do you want to add anything else to that about company culture and education on the regulatory process? And
sure. I mean, I think, as Valentin said, very well, the culture of people coming from traditional tech versus traditional medical device regulatory space, they're very different, and they think about things very differently. I think the key is making sure that both sides understand that their way may not actually be the right or the only way to get it done, and that there's probably something in the middle that's going to work, that maybe the traditional medical device people need to figure out ways to be a little bit more aggressive and creative and thoughtful about how to engage with the agency and how to approach the regulatory process differently to accommodate the culture of the tech company. And the tech companies need to understand that just because what they've done in the past has worked for the products that they've shipped doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to work in a really heavily regulated space where the risk goes up. Because, again, if an app breaks or a consumer piece of hardware breaks, we're all very irritated by it as if it actually is the end of the world, but it isn't, right? And those things can be fixed and our lives might be inconvenienced, but it's not a dramatic problem. If something breaks in the health space, a regulated medical device that you're relying on for diagnosis or treatment or any number of things, it's a very different type of problem and a much more real problem. And so I think finding that ground, that education is really important, recognizing that there's something that each side can contribute, and there's probably bits from the past to bring together in order to get there.
Yeah, and I'm sure Esther is dealing with quite a bit of this as, working in a startup company that's sort of building something like this from the ground up. And I'm sure taking people from all sorts of disciplines and bringing their experience to the table.
Yeah, and that was part of why I wanted to come to Valo, and it's really fun to be able to learn from, like, the engineers are super fun to work with and actually think about things kind of the way that, like, the quality people think about things, like it's very systematic. So there are ways of creating these bridges, but it definitely takes time and effort. And also, as a lawyer, I'm sure at Hogan you see this all the time, that there are actual requirements that are pretty general and flexible. And then there are all of the ways that companies have developed over time to meet those requirements. And some of those are what Jennifer was talking about, where, like, maybe there are other ways of meeting those requirements, and maybe the skills and the practices and the ways of working from the tech side can be leveraged to meet those regulatory requirements. And so just, like, figuring out what you can take from each side to make something that's really game-changing is what it's all about.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's definitely a very exciting space to work in right now. And you guys are very much on the ground, and I see snippets of it as the different projects and companies come across my desk, and we deal with interfacing with FDA. I want to dive into some more details on things to try to give some people some really kind of hands-on practical advice and challenges and things to look out for. Obviously, this is an area of big data. We've talked a lot about data. We've talked about FDA needing a lot of data to really understand the product. So let's talk more about this data. What is this data? Where are people getting it from? How are they training? How are they validating? What are some of the challenges with this? I think, Jennifer, you had some thoughts about this and when we were doing our pre-meeting, so maybe you can get us started, and I'm sure Esther and Valentin have their own perspectives on this as well.
Sure. I mean, there are, as we discussed earlier, there are data sets that can be purchased and used for this purpose. I think one of the questions that's come up as I've been thinking about this is, even before you sort of get to that point, is where are the data actually coming from? Who are the people who are contributing the data? What does the consent process look like in order to be able to use the data for these purposes? I don't know, Frank, I have no idea, so I don't have an answer to this question, but it is something that I do wonder about, because I wonder if when these data were collected, there was even this thinking about using it for these purposes. So are there challenges with respect to what people actually agreed to provide their data for versus what's being done now? I'm not a privacy expert, but privacy is always an issue that comes in, and the number of rules that there are in certain countries. We've got EU, the GDPR. What happens if you're using data from EU citizens, even in the United States? There's implications there. Other countries require health data to be held, in the country. It can't be transferred outside. So, and I don't know the extent to which companies really have insight into all of that when they are purchasing these data sets for use. And so those are all things that, as AI evolves and bigger sets of data are needed, I think we really need to pay close attention to where the data came from in the first place.
If I could come in with a comment on that. So there's the issue of legal suitability of data for training AI algorithms, and it's all to do with consent and permissions for use and all the legal things. There's also a subtle area in if you think about technical suitability. So from an AI point of view, the best kind of data is one that you're trying to use to train an algorithm to do something that humans have been doing in the past. So if what your algorithm is aiming to do is identical to what the humans were doing who generated that data, then have a good match between the data and what you're trying to do. Excuse me, but there are subtle ways in which what you're trying to achieve with AI is somewhat different from how the data was actually generated. And then you can end up in a situation where the data doesn't really tell you what you think it tells you, and the algorithm you're training doesn't achieve what it's aiming to do, because the data, even though superficially looks like it's suitable, it probably isn't, because enough was changed from how it was applied. So ideally, you would have data that was generated from a process that's very similar to what you're trying to achieve with AI from a technical suitability point of view.
And I think that last point is really critical, and it's unique. Well, we can talk about how unique it is in comparison to like a clinical study that's the generation of data that may or may not look exactly like the real world. But the point that you're making, Valentin, about really like the data can create algorithms that are biased in particular ways, that can cause a whole host of problems. So FDA had a public meeting before COVID. I went there in person, and it was about the use of images, and there was a whole discussion about how for some products that FDA had cleared, they were tested and validated on images from certain MRI machines. Turns out they don't work for images from other MRI machines. And so those are now questions that FDA has to ask when those kinds of applications come before them. So thinking about bias and AI is crucial and will be interesting moving forward. And of course, in other arenas, that bias has come out in ways that have caused negative effects for people of color and for women. And so there are a range of social issues too that can come into play. I happen to be our head of privacy. And so the privacy issues that Jennifer is raising are close to my heart. And in the US, our privacy system, if you can even call it that, it is really in need of an update. So it will be interesting to see how that evolves over time and how we as a country decide to improve upon our privacy framework, whether we adopt something that's similar to GDPR or not. But it does create, I think, important restrictions, but restrictions that certain data scientists might not be used to dealing with, that just require new ways of working and even require technological solutions to make sure that we're both doing right by patients, making sure that the use of the data is appropriate, that it's in accordance with the consent, that we're not accidentally re-identifying data, but that also people have enough sort of scientific flexibility and technical flexibility to be able to do the analyses that can uncover insights about biology that are really interesting and useful. The last point I'll make about data is regulatory grade data and what that means. So in FDA's real world evidence framework, there's this concept that there's some data that's good enough and other data that's not good enough. And I think rightly, FDA is taking a use-based approach to that, where certain data sets are useful for to answer certain questions, but not others. And it depends on exactly the question you're asking and what the population is. And there's a whole host of things that are reasonable and also make it really hard for companies, who are trying to figure out, will this data set work for me? Because there's, again, a lot of flexibility. If you're a new company, who's dipping your toe into an FDA regulated space for the first time, there's not a ton of clarity. And I think FDA is working on that too, but I would love to see more of that as time goes on.
Yeah, wow. I mean, Esther, you just raised so many great points, and I wish we had another hour to talk about all of these. I love that Valentina and Esther, you both brought up this patient-centric concept, and because that's really what healthcare is about making patients better, and that's the goal of your companies, is to help patients and help clinicians and get better medical care. I think there's lots of fascinating things that come up with that, and how good is good enough, how is good enough to get to market, what's enough data, what's the level of benefit we need to show, what's the level of risk, and how do we balance this. These are really, really challenging questions to answer from a clinical side, from a business side, from a regulatory side. I'd love to talk more about this bias concept and the putting patient first, and how we deal with that prospectively in data sets and in dealing with FDA. My experience is that the best strategy is a good offense rather than a good defense. But how do companies get on the forefront of this? I know we talked earlier about a heavy education component for FDA and really educating them. So, what are some practical steps here for doing this? How do companies address this on the development side as they're thinking about developing? What are the key players that need to be involved as they start to flesh out new ideas, and how do they carry that forward all the way to going through marketing? Jennifer, I know you've gone through a couple of regulatory submissions directly yourself, so I'm going to start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think
more than a couple.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this sounds very obvious, right? But I think it's really thinking about the edge cases, right? And making sure that you have a data collection plan in place that allows you to make sure that you're testing the product on as wide a range of people as possible. And this, I guess I'm talking less about, data sets purchased for AI use, but just sort of even in your general product development, you want to make sure that you really are you're thinking about those edge cases, because even if the edge cases are, small as far as percentages or absolute numbers, like you still want to make sure that you aren't developing a product that isn't going to work for a certain group of people, right? And so I think that's one of the things that I've seen, companies I've worked with in the past have been really good about making sure that when they are testing products, that you are getting populations in, different countries, across range of spectrums, and really trying to think about, what does that look like, and due to the technology, are there certain things that we need to consider more carefully, right? Like if we know the technology might work differently based upon skin tone, how are we accounting for that in the development that we're doing, things like that. And so I think that's a really important piece of it.
Valentin?
Yeah, so I think the two approaches I would mention is, first is be honest to yourself. So don't try to make it work even if you don't have the data. So kind of make sure that what you're doing is the right thing, and ask the right people. For instance, in our company, we have quite a strong science team. About 10% of our staff are scientists. And we ask them to think of all possible ways this data may not be suitable. And if they can think of some, how do we fix that? If they can't think of any, then probably have a data set that is good for what we're trying to do. So first thing, try and do your homework and really use scientific practice, or try and break it as hard as you can. And if you can't, then you may be onto something. And then once you think you have a solution, go and talk to the regulator. Don't just go there with a submission. We've had a very good experience in a Q-Sub meeting with the FDA. We received very relevant advice to our needs. So, and in my experience, regulators are always happy to talk to companies who are thinking of developing something new. So make contact, get their feeling, understand what their concerns may be, and then how to address those. And then you make progress. Treat the regulator as a partner in the development process.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I also think this is another area where maybe the cultural difference plays out. And I'll also just say my data scientists and engineers are so idealistic. Like they would never want to put out something that would cause harm. But there's also this idea of an MVP, right? Like you put together your minimum viable product, and that'll work for like this set of people. And even though you're ultimately trying to get it to work for this set of people, you can put that out there, you can see where it breaks, and then you can make changes. And that doesn't work because you don't want it to be breaking for all these people. And so that's where the edge case, sort of thinking about the edge cases, and also what Valentin was talking about, we're coming to FDA. The pre-sub process is great because if you miss something, FDA will tell you in the pre-sub. And so you can start having that back and forth with the agency so that you can put forward your best scenario. And like Valentin said, I would definitely come forward with what you think is the best plan to address the edge cases that you've thought of. But to the extent that there are other things, I mean, FDA has its eyes open too. So to have that dialogue.
Yeah, I think we're all in agreement that the pre-sub tool is really critical to success of an ultimate marketing submission, and you get out of it what you put into it, right? The more time you put up front and thinking through some of these scenarios and putting in that education component that we were talking about earlier with Jennifer, to explain the clinical utility and how you're addressing it, and the details of your product and how you plan to move forward with validating your algorithm, the better feedback you'll get from FDA. So I think, we've covered a lot of ground today and we're probably out of time here, but is there anything else that I've missed or that you've missed that you'd like to add as parting words of wisdom to all of our listeners?
If I could just start on that, we talked a lot about the two different cultures. You have people from the clinical world, people from the technical world, and having to work in a health context adds extra requirements on top of the usual technical requirements. But in my experience, technical teams relish that. They really like a challenge. They really like finding a way to address new requirements. So if you bring them along, I think that's the right way to get the best out of them. For instance, there's a lot of conversation about the black box syndrome, where you have an AI algorithm that you don't know what happens inside. Well, if that's not acceptable in your use case, challenge your science team to make it a white box, make it transparent, make it explainable, because there are ways of achieving that. And sometimes you can actually get that and you improve the way the things work. Yeah, I think it's all about that communication between the different stakeholders inside the company and then communication with the regulator. As a parting remark, just really exciting to be in this space in AI and healthcare, and really looking forward to see where the regulatory landscape ends up.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Esther, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I'll just echo that excitement. I love doing panels like this because it reminds me of just how much great work is going on to solve these hard problems and to get smart people together from different disciplines who want to work together to solve hard problems, to make a difference. So I'm looking forward to the years ahead.
Thank you.
I'm not sure I have any wise parting words, but I echo what my fellow panelists have said. I think it's a really exciting space, and it's not just about waiting to see where the regulators land, but really being able to play an active role in how they get there and why they get there. And so I'm honored to be able to be a part of that and see what happens.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I similarly share the excitement. It's, I'm an engineer originally before a lawyer, and development is kind of what gets me out of bed in the morning and continuing doing this job 15 plus years later. So really looking forward to see where things take us and hearing more about all this fantastic development.